January 14th, 1987. The Antarctic Peninsula, where the world ends and silence becomes absolute. Thomas Miller stood at the edge of a frozen coastline, his breath forming crystals in air so cold it burned his lungs. The temperature was negative 35 degrees Fahrenheit, and the gray sky pressed down like a weight. He'd been searching for 3 hours, following coordinates from old expedition maps, looking for something that might not even exist anymore. Then he saw it. At the edge of the frozen sea, partially hidden by a ridge of ice that had only recently melted enough to reveal what lay beneath, stood a tent. Not the modern equipment his team was using. This was old, ancient even by Antarctic standards. The canvas was torn and faded, barely recognizable as the bright orange it must have once been. The frame structure was corroded by decades of salt spray and extreme cold, bent and twisted by countless storms. But it was what lay in front of the tent that made Thomas Miller's blood run cold. A human skeleton stretched out on the ice as if the person had simply laid down to rest. The bones were partially covered by drifted snow, preserved by the sub-zero temperatures that had kept them here for nearly 3 decades. The remains were positioned facing away from the tent entrance, one arm extended toward the sea, where massive icebergs floated in the dark water like monuments to isolation. Thomas knew, even before he radioed his team, even before the DNA tests would confirm it weeks later, whose bones these were. He'd spent 27 years wondering what happened to his father. Now, standing in this desolate place, where gray sky met gray ice, met gray water, he finally had his answer. Before we go deeper into this mystery, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened in this frozen wasteland in 1960 involves a brilliant scientist, an obsessive pursuit of knowledge, and a truth so profound it would drive a man to the literal end of the earth. By the end, you will understand why some discoveries demand everything we have. The question that haunted the Miller family for 27 years was simple but devastating. What happened to David Miller on July 23, 1960? Why did a world-renowned marine biologist vanish into the Antarctic winter, leaving behind a wife, a 7-year-old son, and research that would remain unfinished for decades? And most terrifying of all, why did he die alone, in a tent by the frozen sea, miles from anyone who could have saved him? To understand the magnitude of what was lost that winter night in 1960, you need to understand who David Miller was. Not the scientist whose name appeared in academic journals, not the researcher who won prestigious grants. The man, the father, the human being who would make a choice that would destroy his family even as it might have advanced human knowledge. David Miller was 34 years old in the summer of 1960, though everyone who knew him said he had the energy of someone much younger and the wisdom of someone much older. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, which made him unusually tall for his generation, and he carried himself with the slightly awkward posture of someone who'd spent more time bent over microscopes than standing at attention. His hair was dark brown, always somewhat disheveled because he had a habit of running his fingers through it when he was thinking deeply about something, which was most of the time. His eyes were hazel, the kind that shifted between green and brown depending on the light, and they had a quality that his wife Jennifer would later describe to investigators as perpetually curious. He looked at everything, from the most mundane household object to the most complex biological specimen, with the same intensity of focus. His daughter from his first marriage would remember that he could spend an hour watching ants on the sidewalk, fascinated by their organizational behavior. He had a strong jaw and prominent cheekbones, and in photographs from that era, he always looked slightly uncomfortable, as if posing for pictures was a waste of time that could be better spent in a laboratory. He wore glasses, round wire-framed ones that were constantly sliding down his nose. He'd push them back up absently, a gesture so habitual that people who knew him would unconsciously mimic it when talking about him. David was born in Seattle, Washington in 1926, the son of a fisherman and a schoolteacher. Growing up along the Pacific coast, he developed an early fascination with marine life. While other children collected baseball cards, David collected tide pool specimens. While other teenagers went to dances, David spent his evenings at the University of Washington Library, reading everything he could find about oceanography and marine biology. He was brilliant. That was never in question. He'd graduated from the University of Washington at 20 with a degree in marine biology, completed his doctorate at Stanford by 24, and by the time he was 30, he'd published 17 papers in prestigious scientific journals. His specialty was studying organisms in extreme environments, particularly the unique adaptations of marine life in polar regions. But what made David truly exceptional wasn't just his intelligence, it was his passion. He didn't study marine biology as a career. He studied it as if his life depended on understanding every detail of how life survived in the harshest conditions on Earth. Former colleagues would later tell investigators that David had an almost spiritual relationship with his work. He believed, deeply and genuinely, that understanding how life adapted to extreme environments could unlock fundamental secrets about the nature of life itself. His personal life was more complicated. He'd been married once before, in his early 20s, to a woman named Carol. They'd had one daughter together, but the marriage lasted only 3 years. Carol would later say that David was married to his work first, and to her second, and she couldn't compete with an obsession. The divorce was amicable, and David remained involved in his daughter's life, though his work often kept him away for months at a time. He met Jennifer Howard in 1952 at a scientific conference in San Francisco. She was a librarian at the University of California, helping organize the conference materials. David had been giving a presentation on Antarctic krill populations, and Jennifer, who had no background in science but was intellectually curious about everything, stayed to listen. After his talk, she asked him a question that no one else had thought to ask. Something about how the research might affect future food security for the planet. David was intrigued by her ability to see the bigger picture, and they talked for 3 hours over coffee. They married 6 months later, in a small ceremony at a church in Berkeley. Jennifer understood, from the beginning, what she was getting into. David had been honest with her about his priorities. His work came first, but that didn't mean he loved her less. It meant that he loved his work in a way that most people couldn't understand. Jennifer accepted this. She was a patient woman, and she believed in the importance of what David was trying to accomplish. Their son, Thomas, was born in 1953, and David experienced something he hadn't expected: a profound, almost overwhelming love for this small human being. He'd been a distant father to his first daughter, by his own admission, too consumed with his research. But with Thomas, he tried harder. He'd take the boy to the aquarium in Seattle, explaining in patient detail how each creature had evolved to survive in its particular environment. He'd bring home specimens, letting Thomas look through his microscope. He was still gone frequently for research expeditions, but when he was home, he was truly present. David's daily routine, when he wasn't on expedition, was meticulously structured. He'd wake at 5 a.m. every morning, make strong black coffee, and spend 2 hours reviewing data or writing before Jennifer and Thomas woke up. Breakfast was at 7:30, and he'd always eat with his family, asking Thomas about school, helping with homework when needed. By 9 a.m., he'd be at his laboratory at the University of Washington's Oceanography Department, where he'd work until 7 p.m. Evenings were for family, but there was always a notebook nearby, and Jennifer grew accustomed to watching him suddenly stop mid-conversation to jot down an idea. His colleagues described him as brilliant but intense. He had little patience for what he considered intellectual laziness or imprecise thinking. He could be abrasive in academic discussions, though never cruel. He simply cared, too, much about the accuracy of scientific knowledge, to let errors or sloppy methodology go unchallenged. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, he was respected. When David Miller spoke at conferences, people listened. In the spring of 1960, David received the opportunity he'd been waiting his entire career for: a position with a research expedition to an American research outpost on Anvers Island on the Antarctic Peninsula. The temporary station, established specifically for a multi-year study of Antarctic marine ecosystems, needed someone with David's expertise. The position was for 9 months, from April through December, spanning the Antarctic winter. Jennifer was 3 months pregnant with their second child when David told her about the opportunity. She was understandably conflicted. Their daughter would be born while he was gone, and he'd miss the first months of her life. But David was almost manic with excitement. The Antarctic was the most extreme environment on Earth. The waters held species that existed nowhere else, organisms that had evolved in complete isolation for millions of years. This was the culmination of everything he'd worked for. They had the argument that years later, Jennifer would replay endlessly in her mind. She asked him to decline the position, to wait for another opportunity when the timing was better. David refused. Opportunities like this came once in a lifetime, he said. The research couldn't wait. Science didn't pause for personal convenience. In the end, Jennifer gave him her blessing, though it felt more like surrender than agreement. David promised he'd be home by Christmas, in time to meet their daughter. He promised he'd write every week, that he'd think of them constantly. He kissed Jennifer goodbye on April 3, 1960, at the Seattle airport. He held 7-year-old Thomas tightly, telling the boy to be brave, to help his mother, to be the man of the house while Daddy was away. David Miller boarded a military transport plane bound for Punta Arenas, Chile, the jumping-off point for Antarctic expeditions. He was carrying 3 suitcases full of equipment, a journal for recording observations, and a photograph of his family that he'd keep on his makeshift desk in the research station. 3 months later, he would be dead. His son would spend 27 years wondering why, and the frozen continent would keep its secrets, until the ice finally melted enough to reveal the truth. July 23, 1960. Antarctic Peninsula Research Station, the heart of Antarctic winter. For those unfamiliar with Antarctic conditions, the winter is not like winter anywhere else on Earth. At the station's latitude, 64 degrees south, winter means permanent darkness. The sun sets in mid-April and doesn't rise again until late August. For months, the world exists in a perpetual twilight, broken only by artificial lights, and on clear nights, the haunting glow of the aurora, australis, dancing across the southern sky. The temperature on July 23rd was negative 38 degrees Fahrenheit, and that was before wind chill. With wind, which was constant at around 45 miles per hour, the effective temperature was closer to negative 70. At those temperatures, exposed skin freezes in less than 5 minutes. Breath freezes instantly upon leaving the body. Metal becomes so brittle it can shatter. The sea itself, except where currents keep it moving, freezes solid. The research station in 1960 was not the relatively comfortable facility Antarctic bases would become in later decades. It was a collection of prefabricated buildings connected by rope lines so that people wouldn't get lost in the frequent whiteout conditions. There were 12 permanent staff members during the winter, 6 scientists, 4 support staff, a medic, and a station manager. They lived in close quarters, dependent on each other for survival, going slightly mad from isolation and darkness. David Miller had been at the station for 3 months by July. His letters home, which arrived irregularly via supply ship, were filled with excitement about his research. He was studying a particular species of Antarctic cod that seemed to produce natural antifreeze proteins in their blood. Understanding how these proteins worked could have applications for organ preservation, for agriculture in cold climates, for countless other uses. He was making progress, he wrote. Real, groundbreaking progress. But according to his fellow researchers, something had changed in David during late June and early July. He'd become withdrawn, secretive. He'd stopped attending the communal dinners that were an important part of station morale. He spent hours alone in the small laboratory module, working on something he wouldn't discuss. When asked about it, he'd become evasive, saying only that he was following an unexpected lead in his research. On July 22nd, David had a conversation with the station manager, Robert Hayes, asking permission to take a snowmobile to a remote coastal research site about 15 miles from the station. Hayes was reluctant. Weather forecasts indicated a severe storm system moving in. David insisted. He needed samples from that specific location, he said. The opportunity couldn't be missed. Hayes finally agreed, but only on the condition that David be back by nightfall the following day, before the worst of the storm hit. David left the research station on the morning of July 23rd at 8 a.m. The station log shows he checked out a snowmobile, cold weather survival gear including a tent, sleeping bag rated to -50 degrees, emergency rations for 5 days, flares, a radio, and various scientific equipment. He told Hayes he'd radio in every 4 hours to confirm his position and status. His first radio call came at noon, right on schedule. David reported that he was making good progress, that weather conditions were manageable, that he expected to reach the coastal site by 4 p.m. His voice on the radio was described as excited, almost agitated. The radio operator asked if everything was all right, and David replied, "Better than all right. I was right. I was absolutely right." The second radio call came at 4:15 p.m. David had reached the coastal research site. He was setting up his tent for the night, planning to collect samples in the morning when light conditions improved. Though improved was relative in Antarctic winter. He described the location, a rocky outcrop where ice-free water flowed due to geothermal vents, creating a small oasis of liquid water in an otherwise frozen sea. The call lasted 7 minutes. David sounded professional, focused. The third radio call should have come at 8 p.m. It didn't. At 8:30 p.m., the radio operator tried to contact David. No response. He tried again at 9 p.m., at 9:30, at 10. Nothing but static. Hayes wasn't immediately worried. Radio equipment could fail in extreme cold. David was an experienced researcher, he had adequate supplies, and he'd weathered Antarctic conditions before. At 11 p.m., David's radio came to life. The connection was poor, broken by static and interference. But David's voice was unmistakable, and it carried an emotion that several people listening later described as awe mixed with fear. "Research Station, this is Miller. the transmission began. "I need you to understand something. What I've found here, it changes everything. Everything we thought we knew about static. Not just adaptation, it's more static. They couldn't have evolved this way. Not naturally. Not in static again. Longer this time." Hayes grabbed the radio handset. "Miller, you're breaking up. Repeat your last transmission. What have you found?" There was a long pause, filled with the crackling of interference. Then David's voice came through again, clearer, but somehow more distant. "I need to collect more samples. I need more time. Tell Jennifer. Tell her I'm sorry, but this is too important. This is what I've spent my whole life searching for." Miller, negative. Storms intensifying. Return to base immediately. That's an order. Another pause. Then, "I can't. Not yet. Just one more day. I need one more day." David. Hayes rarely used first names on official radio communications. "The storm will be Category 5 by dawn. If you're not back here in the next 4 hours, you won't make it back at all. Come home." The last thing David Miller said, recorded in the station log and later transcribed for the investigation, was, "Some discoveries are worth dying for. Station out." The radio went silent. Hayes tried repeatedly to re-establish contact. Nothing. At 11:45 p.m., he made the decision to launch a rescue operation, despite the worsening weather. 3 men, including Hayes, geared up to take 2 snowmobiles out to David's last known position. They made it less than 2 miles from the station before the full fury of the Antarctic winter hit. The wind reached 80 miles per hour. Visibility dropped to less than 3 feet. The temperature plummeted to -50 degrees. One of the snowmobiles broke down, its engine seizing in the extreme cold. The 3 men barely made it back to the research station alive, connected by rope, moving inch by inch through whiteout conditions. The storm lasted for 6 days, 6 days of screaming. Wind and blowing snow and darkness so complete it was like being buried alive. 6 days during which the research station was completely cut off from the outside world, during which everyone inside knew that if David Miller was still alive out there, he wouldn't be by the time the storm ended. On July 30th, when the storm finally broke, the research station organized the largest search and rescue operation in Antarctic history up to that point. The U.S. Navy diverted a helicopter from AEE ship stationed off the coast. Chilean authorities sent 2 planes from their Antarctic bases. Every person at Palmer Station who could be spared joined the search. They found the snowmobile first, about 12 miles from the station, abandoned and half-buried in a snowdrift. The key was still in the ignition. The engine was intact, though frozen solid. There was no note, no indication of why David had left it there. Tracks leading away from the snowmobile were long since erased by the storm. 2 miles from the snowmobile, they found David's emergency pack, including his flares and most of his food rations. It was sitting on top of a pressure ridge, clearly visible, as if deliberately left as a marker. Inside was a single page torn from David's field notebook. On it, written in his precise handwriting, was a series of coordinates, followed by the words, "Life finds a way, even here, especially here." The coordinates led to a remote coastal area, even more isolated than where David had originally planned to work. It took the search team 3 days to reach it, moving carefully through unstable ice formations and around dangerous crevasses. When they finally arrived, they found signs of recent activity. Disturbed snow, marks where tent stakes had been driven into frozen ground, a small area where ice had been chipped away as if someone was collecting samples. But no tent, no David Miller, no body. The search continued for 2 weeks. Helicopters with thermal imaging. Equipment flew grid patterns over the area. Teams on foot and snowmobile covered hundreds of square miles. Divers examined the waters around the coastal site. Despite the danger of diving in Antarctic conditions, they found nothing. The investigation that followed involved multiple governments. David was an American citizen working at an American research station, but he'd disappeared in international waters under Chilean administrative authority. The FBI sent 2 agents to interview station staff. The Navy conducted its own investigation. International Antarctic Treaty authorities reviewed all station protocols and safety procedures. Everyone at the research station was questioned extensively. What had David been working on? Had he seemed suicidal? Had there been any conflicts? Any reasons someone might want to harm him? The answers were consistent. David had been obsessed with his research, but not suicidal. He'd been secretive about what he was working on, but not paranoid. He'd had no enemies, no conflicts serious enough to motivate violence. His laboratory workspace at the research station was examined. His notes were collected and reviewed by a panel of marine biologists. What they found was brilliant but incomplete work on antifreeze proteins in Antarctic cod. Nothing that would explain David's final radio transmission about a discovery that changed everything. Nothing that would explain why he'd risk his life to stay one more day at a remote research site. The prevailing theory, the one that everyone eventually accepted because no alternative made sense, was straightforward. David Miller had become so focused on his research that he'd lost perspective on the danger he was in. He'd stayed too long at the remote site. When the storm intensified faster than forecast, he'd tried to return to the station, but had become disoriented in whiteout conditions. He'd wandered away from his snowmobile, possibly suffering from hypothermia-induced confusion. He'd died somewhere in the vast Antarctic wilderness, and his body had been buried by the storm, likely in a crevasse or under snowdrifts that might take decades to melt. It was a tragic but unremarkable story. Another scientist who'd pushed too far, taken one too many risks in the pursuit of knowledge. The Antarctic was unforgiving. People died there, and their bodies often remained lost forever in the ice. In Seattle, Jennifer Miller received the news on August 5, 1960. She was home from the hospital with their newborn daughter, whom she'd named Sarah. She was informed that her husband was missing, presumed dead. There would be no body to bury, no funeral, just a memorial service with an empty casket. 7-year-old Thomas Miller didn't fully understand what had happened. He knew his daddy was gone, that he wouldn't be coming home for Christmas, or ever. He knew his mother cried at night when she thought he was asleep. He knew that something fundamental had broken in their family, a hole that would never quite close. The Navy declared David Miller officially deceased on December 23, 1960, 5 months after his disappearance. Jennifer received his life insurance payout and his death benefits. She received his personal effects from the research station, including the photograph of the family that had sat on his desk. She received the condolences of the scientific community, letters from colleagues expressing their shock and sadness. What she didn't receive was an explanation. The official report said David had died in an accident caused by severe weather and possibly impaired judgment. But Jennifer knew her husband. He was meticulous, careful, especially when it came to safety protocols. He wouldn't have stayed at that remote site without a compelling reason. His final radio transmission suggested he'd found something extraordinary, something worth risking everything for. But what? What discovery could possibly be so important? The investigation had reviewed all his research notes and found nothing unusual. The marine biologists who examined his work said it was impressive, but not revolutionary. Whatever David thought he'd discovered had died with him. Jennifer Miller spent the rest of her life wondering. She raised Thomas and Sarah alone, never remarrying. She kept David's laboratory notebooks in a trunk in the attic, hoping that someday someone might find the answer hidden in his meticulous scientific observations. That someone would turn out to be Thomas himself. 27 years after his father vanished into the Antarctic darkness, Thomas Miller would return to the frozen continent, armed with new technology, new information, and an obsessive need to understand what had happened to his father. And on a gray January day in 1987, standing before a torn tent by a frozen sea, looking down at bones that had waited decades to be found, he would finally learn the truth. The years following David, Miller's disappearance were marked by a peculiar kind of grief, the kind that comes without closure, without certainty, without the finality that allows healing to begin. For Jennifer Miller, every day was an exercise in convincing herself that her husband was truly gone, even as a small, irrational part of her wondered if perhaps the reports were wrong, if perhaps David had survived somehow. She moved with the children back to her parents' home in Portland, Oregon, unable to bear staying in the Seattle house, where every corner held memories of David. Thomas started third grade at a new school where none of the other children knew his story. Jennifer got a job at the Portland Public Library, the same kind of work she'd done before meeting David. Life continued, as it had to, but it was a diminished life, lived in the shadow of an unanswered question. Thomas grew up with the weight of his father's disappearance shaping everything about him. He had only fragmented memories of David. The smell of his father's coffee in the mornings, the sound of his voice reading bedtime stories, the feeling of being lifted onto broad shoulders. But these memories felt more like dreams than reality, growing hazier as the years passed. What Thomas had, instead of solid memories, was a mythology. His mother would tell him stories about David's brilliance, his passion for science, his dedication to understanding the natural world. Jennifer never spoke about the arguments they'd had, never mentioned her anger at David for choosing an Antarctic expedition over witnessing his daughter's birth. She created for her son an idealized version of his father, a hero scientist who'd died in pursuit of knowledge. And Thomas, lacking any way to truly know the man behind the myth, internalized this narrative completely. He decided at age 10 that he would become a marine biologist like his father. He would finish the work David had started. He would honor his father's memory by following in his footsteps. His sister Sarah grew up with no memories of David at all, just stories and photographs. She took a different path, studying art history in college, deliberately choosing a field as far from marine biology as possible. She loved her brother, but she worried about his obsession with their father. "You can't spend your whole life chasing a ghost," she told Thomas when he was 23 and applying to graduate programs in marine biology. He'd smiled and said, "Watch me." Thomas excelled in his studies. He had inherited David's intelligence and his capacity for intense focus. He completed his undergraduate degree at the University of Washington, the same school his father had attended. He earned his doctorate at Stanford, again following David's path. His dissertation was on survival mechanisms in extremophile organisms, a direct continuation of David's research interests. But throughout his academic career, Thomas had a parallel obsession: understanding exactly what had happened to his father on July 23, 1960. He filed Freedom of Information Act requests to obtain copies of the investigation reports. He tracked down and interviewed former Palmer Station staff members, now elderly men scattered across the country. He learned everything he could about Antarctic conditions, about the specific area where David had disappeared. In 1984, Thomas made his first trip to Antarctica, joining a research expedition as a junior scientist. He didn't tell his mother the real reason he was going. She would have tried to stop him, would have said he was putting his own life at risk, chasing shadows. But Thomas needed to see the place where his father had spent his final months, needed to stand where David had stood. The research station had been rebuilt and modernized since 1960, but the essential geography was the same. The endless ice, the dark water, the sense of being at the absolute edge of the world. Thomas understood, standing there in the perpetual daylight of Antarctic summer, why his father had been drawn to this place. There was something profound about the Antarctic, something that called to a certain type of person. It was the last true wilderness, the last place where humans were visitors rather than masters. During that first expedition, Thomas spent his official work time on his assigned research projects, but every spare moment was spent poring over old maps, trying to determine the exact location where his father had set up his final camp. The coordinates from David's final note had been recorded in the investigation files, but Antarctic ice shifts constantly. The landscape of 1984 was not the same as the landscape of 1960. Thomas talked to old-timers who'd spent decades working in Antarctica. He learned about how glaciers moved, how coastlines changed as ice melted and reformed. He learned about the geothermal vents that David had been studying, stable features in an otherwise changing landscape. If he could find the vents, he reasoned, he could find the approximate location where his father had been working. The expedition ended without any breakthrough. Thomas returned to the United States frustrated, but not defeated. He applied for funding for another Antarctic expedition, this time specifically focused on the area where David had disappeared. The funding was denied. Without a clear scientific justification, without a specific research proposal beyond looking for evidence of what happened to my father, no grant committee would approve the expense. So Thomas took a different approach. He published a paper in 1985 about geothermal vent ecosystems in Antarctic coastal waters. The paper was well received, and it provided the scientific justification for a research expedition to the exact area he wanted to explore. In December 1986, his funding was approved. He would lead a small team to the Antarctic Peninsula in January 1987, ostensibly to study extremophile organisms around geothermal vents. Jennifer knew what her son was really doing. She tried one last time to dissuade him. "Thomas," she said the night before he left, "even if you find him, even if you find what's left of him after all these years, it won't bring him back. It won't give you the father you never really got to know." Thomas had held his mother's hands and said quietly, "I know, but I need to understand why. Why he stayed when he should have left. Why he chose his work over coming home. I need to know if it was worth it." The expedition arrived at the research station on January 3, 1987. Thomas's team consisted of 4 people: himself, 2 other marine biologists, and a logistics coordinator who handled equipment and safety protocols. They spent a week at the station preparing, checking equipment, waiting for a window of acceptable weather. On January 10th, they traveled to the research site, a 15-mile journey that would have taken David hours on a 1960 snowmobile, but took them less than an hour in a modern tracked vehicle. They set up a base camp and began their official research work, collecting samples from the geothermal vent system, documenting the unique microorganisms that thrived in the chemical-rich heated water, But Thomas was also watching the ice. January was summer in Antarctica, and temperatures had been unusually warm that year, hovering around freezing during the day. Glaciers were melting faster than normal. Coastal ice formations that had been stable for decades were breaking apart and drifting out to sea. On January 13th, Thomas took a snowmobile and traveled alone along the coast, ostensibly checking for additional vent sites, but really just exploring, looking for anything unusual. The ice here had definitely retreated since 1960. What had been buried under deep snow and glacial ice for decades was now exposed to air for the first time in a generation. He almost missed it. The tent was the same color as the ice around it, faded to a dirty gray-white by years of exposure. But something about the shape caught his eye, a geometric regularity that didn't belong in the organic chaos of an ice field. Thomas stopped the snowmobile 50 yards away and approached on foot. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The tent was ancient, that was immediately obvious. The canvas was torn in multiple places, the tiers speaking of decades of Antarctic winds tearing at the fabric. The frame structure, which would have been aluminum in 1960, was corroded and rusty, bent at impossible angles by the weight of snow and ice that had pressed down on it year after year. The tent was positioned at the very edge of the frozen sea, where the ice shelf met the water. Behind it, the gray Antarctic sky pressed down heavy with coming snow. Before it, massive icebergs floated in the dark water like monuments, their underwater bulk invisible, their surfaces carved into fantastic shapes by wind and waves. And there, at the entrance to the tent, partially covered by drifted snow, lay the skeleton. Thomas stood motionless for a long time, just staring. He'd spent 27 years imagining this moment, but the reality was somehow both more and less than he'd anticipated. The bones were gray-white, clean, picked bare by the elements, but perfectly preserved by the cold. They were arranged in a position that suggested the person had simply laid down, as if to rest. One arm was extended toward the sea, reaching. Thomas radioed his base camp. "I found him," he said, and his voice sounded strange even to his own ears. "I found my father." The team arrived within an hour. They photographed everything from multiple angles. They documented the scene with forensic precision. The tent, despite its deteriorated condition, had protected its interior from the worst of the elements. Inside, they found equipment: a small camping stove, long since frozen and useless, a sleeping bag, also frozen solid, specimen collection jars, some still containing samples preserved by the constant freezing temperatures. And they found the journal. David Miller's field journal was in a waterproof case, which had kept it relatively intact despite the decades. The pages were frozen together, but carefully thawed, they revealed David's final entries in his distinctive handwriting. The journal would need to be properly analyzed back at the research station, but even in the field, Thomas could read enough to understand. The entries from July 22nd described David's excitement about getting to the research site, his eagerness to collect samples from the geothermal vents. But then, something changed in the July 23rd entries. David had found something in the vent system, something he described as impossible, yet here. In the warming water around the vents, David had discovered organisms unlike anything ever documented. They weren't just adapted to extreme environments, they seemed to be thriving because of the extremes, requiring the chemical-rich, superheated water to survive. But more than that, they displayed biochemical characteristics that were profoundly different from all other known life. David had theorized, based on preliminary analysis of their cellular structure and genetic material, that these organisms might represent a separate evolutionary lineage, so ancient and so fundamentally different that they could potentially indicate an independent origin of life. They weren't related to other extremophiles in the expected ways. Their proteins used different amino acid combinations. Their cellular membranes had a unique composition never before documented. The implications, David wrote, were staggering. If verified by other scientists, if his preliminary findings held up under rigorous analysis, it would suggest that life could start more than once on the same planet. It would suggest that the chemical processes that led to life might be more common than anyone believed. The journal entries became more frantic, more desperate. David knew he needed to get the samples back to Palmer Station, needed to document this discovery properly, needed to bring in other scientists to verify what he'd found. But the storm was coming. He'd tried to pack up, tried to return to base, but his snowmobile wouldn't start. The extreme cold had caused something in the engine to fail. He'd radioed Palmer Station for help, but then made the decision that would doom him. He'd decided to wait out the storm at the research site. He had food, a tent, cold weather gear. He thought he could survive 6 days. He thought the discovery was too important to abandon, even for a few weeks until a rescue team could retrieve him. The final entry in the journal was dated July 29, 1960. David's handwriting was shaky, the letters irregular. He wrote, "I was wrong about the storm. I was wrong about so many things. The tent is holding, barely, but the cold is beyond anything I anticipated. I can't feel my fingers anymore, can't feel my feet. Jennifer, if anyone finds this, tell Jennifer I'm sorry. Tell Thomas his father found something wonderful, even if I can't bring it home." The samples are in the waterproof containers, buried under the cairn of rocks 20 paces northeast of the tent. Someone will find them someday. Someone will understand. I'm going to rest now. Just rest. I can see the aurora through the tear in the tent. It's beautiful. Everything is beautiful when you see it for the last time. That was the final entry. David Miller had frozen to death in his tent, alone, while the storm raged around him. At some point, either during the storm or in the years after, the tent had been torn open. David's body, preserved by the cold, had been moved or had shifted on its own as ice. Beneath it, melted and refroze. The skeleton Thomas found at the tent entrance had likely started the journey inside the tent. Thomas ordered his team to search for the cairn David had mentioned, 20 paces northeast, now buried under decades of ice accumulation. They found it eventually, marked by rocks that were different from the surrounding geology, clearly placed there by human hands. Beneath the rocks, frozen into solid ice, were 3 waterproof specimen containers. The DNA analysis would come later, back in laboratories in the United States. The scientific papers would be published, peer-reviewed, hotly debated. David Miller's discovery would spark decades of research and controversy. Some scientists supported his hypothesis about a distinct lineage. Others argued the organisms were simply extremely divergent, but still connected to Earth's main evolutionary tree. The debate continues to this day. What's undeniable is that the organisms David found were extraordinary, representing biochemistry at the extreme edge of what was thought possible. David Miller would posthumously receive recognition. His name on the newly discovered organisms, Thermophilus milleri, a posthumous award from the National Science Foundation, acknowledgement as the scientist who'd pushed the boundaries of our understanding of life in extreme environments. But none of that mattered to Thomas, standing in the Antarctic cold, looking at his father's bones. What mattered was understanding. His father hadn't chosen science over family out of callousness or obsession. He'd found something genuinely extraordinary, something that justified the risk he'd taken, even if that risk had cost him everything. Thomas would later tell his mother that he'd found peace in the frozen South. His father had died, yes, but he'd died in pursuit of knowledge that mattered. He'd died knowing he'd succeeded. That had to count for something. Jennifer Miller, now 67 years old, listened to her son's story and wept, not just for her husband, but for all the years she'd spent angry at him, all the years she'd told herself he'd valued his work more than his family. Now she understood. David had thought he'd survive. He'd thought he could have both, the discovery and the family. He'd been wrong, but it had been a mistake born from passion and hope, not from callousness. David Miller's remains were brought back to the United States and buried in Seattle, in a cemetery overlooking Puget Sound, the water he'd loved since childhood. The funeral, held on March 15, 1987, was attended by hundreds of people: family, friends, colleagues, scientists who'd read his papers and been inspired by his work. Thomas Miller gave the eulogy. He talked about a father he'd barely known, but had spent his life trying to understand. He talked about sacrifice and passion and the price of discovery. He ended by saying, "My father died alone in the coldest place on earth, but he died knowing he'd found something that mattered." Not everyone gets that certainty at the end. I think he would have said, it was worth it. So, what really happened to David Miller? After 27 years of mystery and the stunning discovery of his remains and journal, do we finally have the complete answer? In some ways, yes. In others, the questions remain. What we know for certain is this: David Miller traveled to a remote coastal research site on July 23, 1960. He discovered organisms around geothermal vents that represented a separate origin of life, a discovery that would eventually revolutionize our understanding of biology and the potential for life elsewhere in the universe. His snowmobile broke down, stranding him at the site as a severe storm approached. He chose to wait out the storm rather than abandon his samples and research equipment. He survived 6 days in his tent before freezing to death. Likely on July 29th, his body remained at the site, preserved by Antarctic cold until glacial melting exposed the location 27 years later. These are facts, documented and verified through physical evidence, journal entries, and scientific analysis of the organisms he discovered. But questions remain. Could David have survived if he'd made different choices? Almost certainly, yes. If he'd abandoned his equipment and samples and walked the 15 miles back to Palmer Station immediately when his snowmobile failed, he likely would have made it. The storm didn't reach full intensity until several hours after his final radio transmission. He had time. Why didn't he? The journal provides some insight, but not complete answers. David believed his discovery was too important to risk losing. He believed he could survive the storm. He believed, perhaps, that the risk was acceptable because the potential reward was so great. Was he right? That's a question each person must answer for themselves. Yes, David's discovery was scientifically significant. Yes, it advanced human knowledge in meaningful ways. But was it worth his life? Was it worth leaving his wife to raise 2 children alone? Was it worth Thomas growing up without a father? David himself seemed to have doubts, based on his final journal entries. He wrote about regret, about wishing he'd been more careful, about hoping Jennifer would understand. But he also wrote about the beauty of what he'd found, about the privilege of being the first human to understand that life had begun twice on Earth. Some investigators and psychologists who've studied the case suggest that David's decision was influenced by summit fever, a psychological phenomenon well documented in mountaineering where climbers take deadly risks to reach a summit because they're so close to their goal. David was so close to confirming his discovery, so close to proving something extraordinary that he couldn't force himself to abandon it even when the rational choice was clear. Others suggest that David suffered from impaired judgment due to the extreme environment. Living in constant darkness, isolated from normal society, working in temperatures that strain the limits of human survival, all of these factors can affect decision-making. David might not have been thinking clearly when he chose to stay at the research site. There's also a darker question that some have raised. Did David, on some level, choose to die? Was this less an accident and more a deliberate decision to sacrifice himself for his work? His final journal entries don't support this theory, but they don't definitively rule it out either. David was a man who'd dedicated his entire life to science, who'd acknowledged that his work came before personal relationships. Did he, facing the choice between saving himself and saving his discovery, make a conscious decision to prioritize the work? We'll never know for certain what was in David Miller's mind during those final days. What we do know is that his death wasn't meaningless. The organisms he discovered have been named Thermophilus milleri in his honor. Research based on his samples has led to advances in understanding how life can survive in extreme environments, which has implications for the search for life on other planets. His sacrifice, if we can call it that, contributed to human knowledge in real and lasting ways. Thomas Miller, now a respected marine biologist in his own right, has continued his father's work. He's led multiple expeditions to Antarctic geothermal vents, discovering additional species and further validating David's original findings. He's written extensively about his father's research and about the ethical questions surrounding scientific risk-taking. He's argued that while David's choice resulted in tragedy, it also represented the best aspects of scientific inquiry. The willingness to push boundaries, to take risks in pursuit of understanding. Sarah Miller, David's daughter, who never knew him, has a different perspective. She's said in interviews that she wishes her father had come home, had prioritized his family over his work, even if it meant the discovery remained hidden for years or decades until someone else found it. She's argued that no discovery, no matter how significant, justifies leaving children fatherless. Both perspectives are valid. Both represent important truths about the complicated legacy of David Miller's life and death. Jennifer Miller passed away in 2003 at age 75. Before her death, she told Thomas that she'd forgiven David years ago, that understanding what had happened and why had given her peace. She said that David had been wrong to take the risk he'd taken, but that she understood why he'd done it. "Your father," she told Thomas, "loved us deeply. But he loved knowledge too, and sometimes those loves came into conflict. He did the best he could with an impossible choice. The torn tent where David died no longer exists. The warming climate that revealed his remains in 1987 has continued to melt Antarctic ice. The site where David's tent stood is now open water for part of each year. The ice that preserved his body for nearly 3 decades long since melted away. In a few more decades, climate change may erase all physical evidence that David Miller was ever there. But his discovery remains. The organisms that thrived in those geothermal vents, the separate lineage of life that David gave his life to document, continue to be studied by scientists around the world. They've forced us to reconsider our understanding of how life begins, how common it might be in the universe, and what forms it might take. David Miller's skeleton now rests in Seattle, but his legacy lives in research papers and scientific debates, and in the work of scientists who continue to push into extreme environments looking for life in unexpected places. Every time a researcher discovers a new extremophile organism, every time someone studies how life survives in impossible conditions, they're building on the foundation David laid. Was it worth it? That question has no objective answer. For David, in his final moments, writing in his journal by lamplight as the storm raged outside, it seems he believed it was. "Someone will understand," he wrote. "Someone will see what I saw." 27 years later, his son stood where David had stood, holding the samples David had preserved, reading the words David had written. Thomas understood. He saw what his father had seen. And in that understanding, across 27 years, and the vast gulf between living and dead, father and son connected. That connection, perhaps, is its own kind of answer. David Miller died alone in the Antarctic, but his work, his passion, and his discoveries lived on through those he'd left behind. He'd hoped someone would understand someday. Someone did. Rest in peace, David Miller. Your sacrifice was not forgotten. Your discovery was not lost. Your son made sure of that.